The flower was white. A small white carnation, the kind you pin to a lapel before something important. Something you have been looking forward to for months. I had bought it that morning from a florist on Elizabeth Street. A woman with silver hair who tucked it into a little square of waxed paper and said, in the way that Hobart women sometimes say things, with warmth layered under restraint, "Someone's got a big day ahead." I smiled and told her my son was getting married. She said that was the loveliest thing she had heard all week. I sat in the car with that flower on my lap for 4 hours. I need you to sit with that sentence for a moment before I continue. Not 4 minutes, not 40, 4 hours. I sat in an old blue Toyota Camry on a side street just off Salamanca Place while my son's wedding took place in a building I could see from the windscreen, and I watched strangers in good shoes walk through the door that I had not been invited to walk through. I watched the winter light shift across the sandstone. I watched the bare trees on the footpath move in the wind that comes off the Derwent River in July and has no patience for anyone. I watched all of it through glass that kept fogging at the edges because I was breathing. Just breathing, which turns out to be enough to blur the world when the world has already blurred itself past recognition. My name is Leonard Ashford. I am 58 years old. I have lived in Hobart for most of my adult life, in a small house on Napoleon Street in Battery Point, a neighborhood of steep hills and old stone and mornings that smell like salt water and cold. I worked for 31 years as a maintenance mechanic at the port. I have hands that show it. I have knuckles that have been split and healed and split again. I have a watch that cost $40 and keeps perfect time. I was married for 26 years to a woman named Nora, who died 3 years ago in the early hours of a Tuesday morning in the winter, quietly, the way she did most things, without making anyone worry more than necessary. I had one son, Callum, 34 years old on the day of his wedding to Imogen Wallace. I need to tell you how I came to be sitting in that car, holding that flower. I need to start a little earlier than the morning of the wedding, because the morning of the wedding was the end of something, not the beginning. What happened to me that day did not arrive without warning. It arrived with a great deal of warning, quietly delivered over several years. In small moments I kept choosing to explain away, because explaining them away was easier than accepting what they were. But I will start with the car. I will start with Callum's face reflected in the passenger window as he adjusted his tie, a deep burgundy tie I had never seen before, against a white shirt that fit him perfectly. In the careful way expensive shirts fit people who have decided to become someone different from who they were raised to be. He was not cruel about it. That is the thing I need you to understand before anything else. Callum was not a cruel person. He was a frightened one, and frightened people do things that look like cruelty from the outside but feel, from the inside, like necessary engineering. He said, "Just wait here, Dad. It's only for an hour. We hired someone for the photographs." I heard the words. I understood the grammar. My mind went through the sentence the way you go through a dark room when the power has gone out, carefully, touching each piece of furniture to confirm it is still where it belongs. We hired someone. For the photographs. I said, "I'm sorry?" He looked at his tie. He did not look at me. It's a presentation thing. The Wallaces have a certain expectation about how things look. I'll explain later. It's just the formal shots. Just stay here until I come and get you. He got out of the car. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the entrance of the venue, which was a restored heritage building near Salamanca Arts Center, the kind of place that charges a great deal to make an event feel old and important. And before he reached the door, he was joined by a man I had never seen before. 54 years old, perhaps, silver at the temples, good posture, a dark suit that had been pressed with intention. He smiled at Callum with the particular warmth of someone who has been rehearsed into warmth, and Callum touched his arm briefly, and the two of them went through the door together. Someone standing nearby, a woman in a pale green coat who was apparently one of Imogen's cousins, turned to the man beside her and said something I could not hear. But I saw the man nod toward the door, and I saw his mouth form two words. Father of the groom. I sat with the carnation on my lap, and I did not start the engine. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment because I think precision matters here more than drama. I did not feel rage. I did not feel the particular electric shock of humiliation. What I felt was something quieter and more architectural. Something load-bearing inside me had been removed. Not broken, removed, cleanly, with apparent planning. And I was still standing because old structures sometimes stay upright for a while after the thing that held them together is gone. Inertia, habit, the simple fact of not knowing yet how to fall. The wind moved the trees on the footpath. Someone's mobile rang somewhere nearby and was answered quickly. A parking attendant walked past and glanced at my car and kept moving. I put the carnation on the passenger seat. That is where the story begins. Not with the moment things went wrong, because things had been going wrong for long enough that I had stopped being able to see where wrong had started, but with a flower on a passenger seat and a man who had been told to wait. I should tell you about Nora, not because you need her biography, not because her death is the center of this story, though it changed the shape of everything that followed. I should tell you about Nora because you cannot understand what Callum lost and what I lost and what the gap between us eventually became without understanding who she was and what she built in that house on Napoleon Street. Nora Ashford was not a complicated woman, in the way that people who write about grief tend to describe the dead. She was not mysterious. She was not larger than life. She was, in the plainest and most honest sense of the word, good. She was patient with difficulty. She laughed at things that other people found ordinary. She kept a garden in the backyard that never looked quite how she wanted it to look, but that she tended every weekend with cheerful stubbornness, talking to the roses the way you talk to someone who is trying their best. She made decisions slowly and kept them firmly. She loved Callum with a steadiness that he could push against without it moving, which is the best kind of love for a young person who needs to test whether something will hold. She died of a stroke. She was 55 years old. She was in the garden on a Saturday afternoon in late May, and I was inside doing something completely ordinary, something I cannot even remember now because the memory of the ordinary has been replaced entirely by the memory of finding her and the sequence of things that followed finding her. The phone call, the ambulance, the hospital, the corridor, the doctor's face. She died at 20 minutes past 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was sitting beside her when it happened, and it was quiet, just as I said, and I held her hand until it was not possible to pretend anymore that she could still feel it. Callum was 31 at the time. He had been living in Hobart but working for a small architecture firm and spending increasing amounts of time on the mainland for work. He came home when I called. He stayed for the funeral. He stayed for 2 weeks after. And then he went back, because he had a life that had been built to continue. And grief does not stop a life. It only slows it, and sometimes warps it into unfamiliar shapes. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it as fact. He went back to his life. I stayed in mine, which was now missing the thing it had been built around for 26 years. In the months that followed Nora's death, Callum and I found a new rhythm. It was not a close rhythm. Phone calls every week or two. Visits at Christmas and sometimes in winter. He told me about his work. I told him about the port and the garden and the things I was fixing around the house. We did not talk about Nora very much, not because the subject was forbidden, but because we were both, in our different ways, learning how to carry something that did not have a comfortable shape. Then he met Imogen. I want to be fair to Imogen Wallace because the story I am telling you is not her fault, and I do not want you to leave thinking it was. Imogen was 30 when Callum first brought her to Hobart, a tall woman with precise manners and a laugh that surprised you because it was bigger and less careful than everything else about her. She was kind to me. She asked me questions about the port and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. She held her tea with both hands and looked out the window at the Derwent and said, "I can see why you'd never want to leave." Her family was from Launceston. Her father, Graham Wallace, had made his money in commercial property and held it with the particular grip of a man who believes that money and character are the same thing, or ought to be. He had strong opinions about posture and punctuality and the kind of neighborhoods a person ought to live in. He was not unkind, exactly. He was evaluative. He assessed people the way you assess a building. He looked for cracks. The first time I met Graham Wallace was at a dinner in a restaurant on the waterfront, and he asked me what I did for work in the tone of a man who already knew and was waiting to confirm his assumptions. I told him I was a maintenance mechanic at the port. He said, "Ah," in a way that contained an entire verdict. After that dinner, driving home alone along the waterfront, I thought about the way Callum had introduced me. "This is my dad, Leonard. He's been at the port forever, knows every bolt in the place." There was something in the way he said it that I did not quite recognize at the time. A slight deflection, a rounding of the edges, as if he were presenting me in a frame that made me easier to accept from a distance. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that Callum was simply nervous about making a good impression and that I was projecting something onto a sentence that meant nothing. I went home and made tea and sat in the chair that had been mine for 20 years and listened to the wind off the river and told myself I was being a foolish old man. I was not imagining things, but that understanding came slowly, the way most real understandings come. Not as a single revelation, but as a sequence of small moments that accumulate until they have enough weight to be undeniable. The first moment I remember clearly was at Christmas, about 18 months before the wedding. Callum and Imogen were staying at the house. Graham Wallace and his wife Margaret had been invited for Christmas lunch, which Callum had quietly arranged without asking whether I was comfortable hosting people I barely knew in the house where Nora had lived and cooked and died. I had said yes because saying no would have required explaining feelings I was not sure I had the words for. I had been telling a story about Callum's early 20s, about the time he had borrowed a colleague's ute to move a couch into his first flat, and managed to scratch the entire left side of the vehicle against a concrete pillar in a car park, a story I had always found funny and that Nora used to request at gatherings. Callum laughed the first 2 sentences, and then I saw something cross his face, a small movement of the eyes toward Graham Wallace, and he said, "Dad, you don't have to tell the whole thing," in a voice that was pleasant and light and cut the story off at the knees. It was nothing. It was a small thing. The kind of thing that happens at every family table when one generation wants to curate the impression made on another. I know that. I am not claiming it was an act of cruelty. I am saying it was the first crack in a wall that I had not yet understood existed. The second moment came about 6 months later, on the phone. Callum mentioned that he had told the Wallaces that I used to consult for companies in Sydney on marine engineering projects. He said it casually, as if he were telling me about the weather. I sat with the phone against my ear for a moment, and then said, carefully, "Callum, I've never consulted for anyone in Sydney." He said, "I know, Dad, the way things are explained makes a difference with people like them." I asked him what people like them meant. He said, "It doesn't matter, Dad, just if it comes up, you know." I did not tell him that I found this mortifying. I did not tell him that I found the idea of pretending to be something I was not in order to meet some standard I had never agreed to insulting to his mother's memory and to every honest year of my working life. I said, "Right," and we changed the subject, and I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. That is the part that I carry with the most weight, looking back. Not the wedding, not the car, not the carnation. The moment on the phone when I knew clearly what was happening and said, "Right," and let it continue. I could say I stayed silent because I was afraid of losing him. And that is true, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I had been raised by a father who believed that a man absorbs difficulty without making it someone else's problem. And somewhere in my 50-odd years that belief had calcified into something I could not easily dismantle. I did not speak because speaking felt, somehow, like a kind of weakness, like admitting that I needed things to be different. Nora would have spoken. Nora would have called him back within the hour. But Nora was not there, and I was alone in the kitchen, and the garden outside was overgrown because I had not been tending it as well as she would have, and the house was very quiet. The months before the wedding had their own particular geography of small cruelties that were not, individually, cruelties at all. Callum came to visit in the autumn alone, ostensibly to help me with some work on the plumbing that had been giving trouble. He did help with the plumbing, which I appreciated. But during that visit he also said, while we were sitting on the back steps with cups of tea, that he thought it might be better if I did not mention Mum too much at the wedding. He said the Wallaces had not known her, so it might make things feel slightly awkward in the speeches, slightly lopsided. He used the word lopsided. I remember that specifically. I said, "She was your mother, Callum." He said, "I know, Dad. I just think the day needs to be about Imogen and me, not about grief. We don't want anything heavy." I looked at the garden. Nora's roses were doing better than usual that year, which I found both comforting and impossible to explain. "Your mother wouldn't want to make anything heavy," I said. "She was the least heavy person I ever knew." Callum did not say anything to that. He finished his tea. 2 weeks before the wedding, he called to tell me about the arrangements. He told me about the venue, the ceremony, the reception. He told me about the catering and the flowers and the table settings. He told me that the Wallaces were bringing 40 guests and that his own list was mostly colleagues and friends. He told me the ceremony would start at 2:30 in the afternoon. Then he said, in the same light and careful voice he had been practicing for 2 years, that he had been thinking about the photographs. He said the formal wedding portraits were very important to Imogen's family, that the album would be something they kept for decades, that appearances mattered to the Wallaces in ways that were just part of who they were, and that he had made an arrangement, just for the formal shots, just for the official album, that he thought would work best for everyone. I asked him what arrangement. He said he had hired a man named Malcolm Reed to stand in for the formal photographs. He said Malcolm was a local actor, very professional, very discreet. He said it would only be for the portraits, just an hour at most, and that afterward I would be seated with everyone else for the reception. I held the phone, and I breathed. He said, "It's just the visual side of it, Dad. It's just how pictures look." I said, "You want another man to pretend to be your father?" He said, "Just for the photographs." I said, "While I do what?" He said, "Just wait in the car. It's 1 hour, Dad. I'll come get you after." I did not say what I was thinking. I did not say that 1 hour in a car outside your son's wedding is not a small thing. I did not say that there is no version of this that is not an erasure. I did not say that your mother would have burned the wedding down before she let you do this. I said right, which had become my language for things I could not say, and I hung up, and I sat in the chair that had been mine for 20 years, and I looked at the photograph of Nora on the shelf beside the television, and I told her what had just happened. She did not answer, of course, but I had the very strong impression, sitting there in the quiet, that she would not have been silent. The morning of the 14th of July I woke at 6, which is when I always wake, and I lay in the dark for a few minutes listening to the sounds the house makes before the day starts. Old houses on steep streets in Battery Point have their own acoustics. They creak in particular patterns according to the weather. I have lived in that house for 22 years, and I know the difference between the sound it makes on still mornings and the sound it makes when the wind is coming off the river. That morning the wind was significant, the kind that finds gaps you thought you had sealed. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden, which had grown slightly wild again because the autumn had been busy, and I had not been spending as much time out there as I should. Nora's roses were still there, along the back fence. She had planted them the second year we lived in the house, and tended them with a particular devotion that I had always found beautiful and slightly mysterious, given that she was otherwise entirely practical about the natural world. I had the coffee, and I stood there for a long time. Then I went to the florist on Elizabeth Street, and I bought the white carnation. I want to be honest about why I bought it. It was not an act of protest. It was not a statement I was making to anyone. I bought it because it was my son's wedding day, and I was his father, and that is what a man does. He puts on his best clothes, which for me was a dark gray suit that I had bought for Nora's funeral and had worn twice since, and he buys a flower for his lapel, and he gets in the car. I bought the carnation because somewhere between the phone call 2 weeks earlier and the morning of the 14th, I had decided that I would go, that I would sit in the car if that was what was needed, that I would wait, that 1 hour was survivable. I did not know it would be 4. The drive from Napoleon Street to Salamanca takes perhaps 7 minutes, less if the traffic on Davy Street is light, which it was that morning because it was a Saturday in July, and Hobart on winter Saturdays has a particular stillness in the early hours. I parked on a side street half a block from the venue. I sat in the car and I watched the city wake up around me, the cafes beginning to open near Salamanca Place, a man walking a dog at the pace of someone with nowhere to be, the light shifting over the old buildings in the way that winter light in Tasmania does, sideways and pale and very clean. Callum arrived at 12:15. He drove a car I did not recognize, a lease vehicle from the architecture firm, charcoal gray and very clean, and he parked 3 spaces behind me. He came to my window. He was already in the suit. He looked, and I say this without irony, exactly like a man who is getting married. He looked strong and nervous and present in a way that young people are when something enormous is about to happen to them. He said, "You made it." I said, "Of course I made it." He said, "The venue is already open. They're setting up inside." Then he looked at the flower on my lapel, and something moved across his face that I could not name precisely. Not guilt, or not only guilt. Something more complicated. The face of a man who has made a decision and is living in the consequences of it and cannot yet see a way to unmake it without everything falling apart. He said, "Dad, about today, I just want you to know that it's not about you. It's about how things have to look for Imogen's family. You understand that, right?" I said, "I understand that you've asked another man to stand in for you at your wedding." He looked away, down the street toward the river. He said, "It's just the photographs. I'll come and get you as soon as the formal portraits are done. You'll be at the reception. You'll meet everyone." "I'll be in the car," I said, "just for an hour." I did not say anything else. He straightened his jacket. He checked his reflection in the passenger window. He walked toward the venue entrance, and he was joined at the door by Malcolm Reed. I had not seen Malcolm Reed before that moment, except in the mental image I had constructed from the phone call, a professional actor, local, discreet. The man who appeared at the door of the venue fit that description with an accuracy that was almost depressing. He was perhaps 54. He had silver hair brushed back from his forehead and the particular posture of a man who has spent decades being directed about how to stand. His suit was dark and fitted, and he wore it with an ease that made me think of the word appropriate, which is both a compliment and a condemnation, depending on the context. He put his hand briefly on Callum's shoulder as they reached the door. A rehearsed gesture, a prepared piece of warmth. I watched it from 30 meters away through a windscreen that was beginning to fog at the edges, and I did not move. The guests began arriving at 1:30. I watched them from the car. There were perhaps 80 people in total, arriving in pairs and small groups, the women in winter coats and heels navigating the cobbled street with the particular concentration that cobblestones require, the men in dark suits walking slightly faster because cold weather on formal occasions is something men deal with by moving through it. I recognized no one. Callum's friends I had met only briefly over the years, and Imogen's family were strangers to me entirely. At 17 minutes to 2, Graham Wallace arrived. I knew him immediately, even from that distance, even through the fogging glass. He was 63 and he carried himself like a man who had never been uncertain about a room he walked into. He was with his wife, Margaret, who walked beside him with the elegant wariness of a woman who has spent decades managing a husband who takes up more space than he intends to. Graham wore a morning suit which none of the other male guests were wearing, a decision that announced something about his understanding of his own importance. I watched him greet people at the door. I watched him shake hands with Callum and hold the handshake slightly longer than necessary, the grip of a man conducting a small assessment, and then I watched him turn to Malcolm Reed and say something, and Malcolm smile and respond, and Graham nod slowly in the way of a man who is having his expectations confirmed. That was the moment I understood, fully and completely, what this day was. Not just the photographs, not just an hour of inconvenient logistics. This was the replacement of a story. Callum had not simply arranged for a stand-in for the formal portraits. He had arranged for a stand-in for his life. Malcolm Reed was not there to fill a visual gap. He was there to embody an alternative history, a father who looked a certain way, who stood a certain way, who could be presented to Graham Wallace as the kind of man whose son would be acceptable. I sat with that understanding for a long time. The carnation had begun to bruise slightly at the edges, the way white flowers do when they are handled too much. I want to tell you about Eliza Hart before I tell you what she showed me, because the story of what she showed me makes more sense if you understand something about who she was and how she came to be standing on the footpath outside that venue with a camera against her chest and red eyes. Eliza Hart was 46 years old and had been photographing weddings in Tasmania for 17 years. She had a particular reputation in Hobart for the kind of photographs that are not technically perfect, but are true. The light is sometimes wrong, the composition sometimes slightly off-center, but the people in her photographs are always, unmistakably, themselves. She had a gift for waiting for the moment when someone forgets they are being photographed, and in that moment of forgetting, she pressed the shutter. She had been hired by Callum and Imogen 6 months before the wedding. She had met them both twice in the months beforehand to discuss the brief, and she had formed, she told me later, the impression of a couple who genuinely loved each other and who were navigating some kind of social pressure with varying degrees of success. She had not been told about Malcolm Reed. When she arrived at the venue at noon to begin the setup shots, and the coordinators briefed her on the formal portrait requirements, she was told that the father of the groom would be arriving separately and would be available from about 1:15. She assumed this meant me. She prepared accordingly. She chose her angles for the father and son portraits. She thought about the light, which in July in Hobart, at 2:30 in the afternoon, comes from the northwest at a low angle and has a particular quality she liked for formal work. When Malcolm Reed arrived and was introduced to her as Leonard Ashford, she had no reason to doubt it. He was the right age. He was well dressed. He shook her hand and told her he was delighted to be there. She photographed him with Callum in the vestibule while the guests were arriving. She noted that their body language was slightly formal, not unusually so for men of a certain generation, but formal in a way she could not quite account for. The touch did not settle naturally. The smiles were present, but slightly ahead of whatever feeling should have been producing them. She had been a photographer for 17 years. She knew what settled warmth looked like, and this was something slightly different, though she could not have said exactly what. She was adjusting the angle of a reflector in the room, where the formal portraits would happen, when she heard Callum speaking to Malcolm in low, precise tones in the corridor. She was not eavesdropping. She was doing her job 5 meters away behind a half-open door. But the space was small and the corridor was quiet, and voices carry in stone buildings in July. She heard Callum say, "The hand on the shoulder works. Remember to say 'proud of you, son,' when I lean in. Just natural. And if anyone asks about childhood stories, just say it's been a while and laugh it off." She stayed where she was. She heard Malcolm say, "Where is your father, Callum?" A pause. Callum said, "He's waiting in the car." Another pause, longer. Malcolm said, very quietly, "He knows you hired me?" Callum said, "He knows," Malcolm said. "And he's still here? In the car?" Callum said, "Can we focus on the portraits, please?" And then she heard Callum say the sentence that she told me, weeks later, she had been hearing in her sleep. He said, "Some people belong in memory, not in pictures." She stood behind the half-open door with her camera in her hands, and she did not move for perhaps 30 seconds. The camera had been recording ambient footage for a pre-ceremony reel that couples sometimes request, the kind that plays silently during cocktail hour. It was still recording. She did not stop it. She finished the portraits. She photographed the ceremony with the precision and dedication she brought to every wedding she worked. She photographed Graham Wallace watching his daughter walk down the aisle with an expression of enormous satisfaction. She photographed Imogen, who was genuinely beautiful in her dress, with the quality of a woman who has been looking forward to something for a long time and is now living inside it. She photographed Callum saying his vows with the sincerity of a man who meant every word, and the tension of a man who knew that 30 meters away, in a blue Toyota Camry, his father was sitting with a flower on his lap. She photographed Malcolm Reed seated in the front row with his hands folded on his knees in the chair labeled Father of the Groom, watching a ceremony he had no claim to. And when it was over, when the guests moved toward the cocktail space and the formal portraits were done and Callum was occupied with his new wife and her family, Eliza Hart walked out of the building and down the street to where she had, between shots, confirmed through the venue coordinator's offhand comment that there was still a man in a gray suit in the blue car on the side street. I was still there. She knocked on the passenger window and I rolled it down. The cold came in immediately. She said, "Mr. Ashford?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm Eliza, the photographer. Before anyone shows you the wedding album, there's something you need to see." She had red eyes. Not from crying exactly, or not only from crying. The red eyes of someone who has been holding something difficult for several hours with nowhere to put it. I said, "Was it a beautiful ceremony?" She stopped. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I have thought about many times since. Then she said very carefully, "It was. It genuinely was." I nodded. I looked out through the windscreen at the stone building where my son had just been married. "Right," I said. She showed me the footage on the small screen at the back of her camera, shielding it from the wind with her coat. The image was small and the audio was thin through the camera's speakers, but it was clear enough. Clear enough to see Callum's hands, the precise adjustment of Malcolm's shoulder. Clear enough to hear the instructions about the pose and the phrase. Clear enough to hear Malcolm's voice asking where the real father was and Callum's answer. And then the sentence. Some people belong in memory, not in pictures. I watched the screen for a long time after the relevant footage had passed. Eliza did not say anything. She stood beside the car in the cold Hobart wind and she waited, which I have since come to understand was one of the kindest things anyone did for me that day. I did not break anything. I did not shout. I did not start the car with any intention of driving through a reception. The version of me that lives in stories would have done one of those things. The version of me that actually exists sat in the driver's seat of an old blue Toyota and felt the weight of several years of small surrenders arriving all at once, the accumulated mass of every right I had said when I should have said something else. Then I asked Eliza for one thing. I asked her to take my photograph, not inside, not at the wedding, just here, on the footpath, with the building lit behind me and the winter trees above. I got out of the car. I stood on the stone pavement with the bruised carnation in my hand, not pinned to my lapel, just held, the way you hold something you are not sure what to do with. She looked at me for a moment as if making sure I was serious. Then she raised the camera. She took the photograph. I do not know exactly what my face looked like in that image, because I have not allowed myself to study it too closely. But I know what I was thinking when the shutter clicked. I was thinking about Nora in the garden with the roses. I was thinking about a phone call 2 weeks earlier where I said right when I should have said something true. I was thinking about 31 years of maintenance work at the port, about the particular satisfaction of keeping complicated things running, about my hands and what they knew how to do, and what they had built and what they still held. I was thinking, if my son can hire a man to stand where I should be, then at least let there be one true image from today, one record that does not require a performance, one photograph where the man in it is himself. That was all I wanted. Not vindication, not confrontation, not the explosion of a scene that would make everything worse for everyone, including Callum, including Imogen, who knew nothing of the depth of what had been arranged. Just one true photograph, in the cold, with the flower in my hand, on my son's wedding day. Eliza took it. And then she said, very quietly, "He asked me to erase anything with the car, or the street, or anyone who looked like they weren't supposed to be there." She looked at me. She said, "I'm not going to do that." The wind moved the trees above us. Somewhere inside the building, someone laughed at something, the particular bright sound of a cocktail hour going well. I put the carnation in my jacket pocket. "Thank you," I said. "There's more," she said. She turned the camera back to the small screen. "There's something else I recorded. I don't think I was supposed to." She showed me the second piece of footage. It was from inside during the formal portrait session. Imogen was visible at the far edge of the frame, speaking quietly to one of her bridesmaids. The audio was not quite clear enough to hear the words, but Eliza had told me what it contained. Imogen had looked at Malcolm Reed standing beside Callum for a photograph, and then looked at one of the framed photographs that had been placed on a welcome table near the entrance. A photograph of Callum and me from perhaps 8 years earlier, taken at Christmas. She had said to her bridesmaid, "Doesn't the dad look different? I thought he was taller." Her bridesmaid had said, "Maybe it's the suit." Imogen had said, "Maybe." And then Callum had appeared at Imogen's elbow and asked if everything was all right, and Imogen had said yes, everything was wonderful, and the expression on Callum's face in that moment, the very brief, particular expression of a man who has been holding a lie in his hands for a long time and is beginning to feel how heavy it is, that expression was the thing Eliza had recorded without knowing quite what she was recording. The lie had already started to crack, before anyone confronted anything, before any reckoning, before Malcolm Reed decided, during the reception, that he could not hold a microphone and say words that would make something false more permanent than it already was. The lie had started to crack in the moment Imogen looked at a photograph of her husband's actual father and felt, without understanding why, that something did not quite correspond. I stood on the footpath with the camera screen going dark and thought about my son inside that building, carrying his new marriage and his old shame and the weight of what he had arranged, and I felt something that I was not expecting to feel. I felt something very close to sorrow for him, not for myself, for him. Because I was 58 years old, and I knew from experience that the things we do out of fear have a way of becoming the things that define us in the worst possible sense. And I knew that what Callum had done today would follow him with a patience and thoroughness that no wedding coordinator could manage and no actor could stand in for. I went back to the car and I sat down and I looked at the building and I waited. I should tell you about the year after Nora died, because it is the year in which most of what matters about this story was shaped. Callum had come back to Hobart for the 2 weeks after the funeral, and during that time we had been close in the unsteady way that people are close when they are both stunned by the same loss and do not yet know how to proceed without the person who had always been the center. We ate together. We sat together in the evenings. We went through some of Nora's things, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done, and we did it carefully, keeping what needed keeping and acknowledging without too much ceremony what could be let go. In the second week, Callum had been quieter. I put this down to grief, which it partly was, but I also think now, with the understanding that comes from knowing how the story ends, that the quietness of that second week was partly the quietness of a young man looking at his father in a small house in Battery Point, and beginning, not consciously, not maliciously, to calculate the distance between that house and the life he was building. He was 31. He had been with the architecture firm for 3 years and was doing well. He had recently moved into a flat in a part of Hobart that is sometimes described as up and coming, by which people generally mean that the old working families who lived there are being replaced by people who make more money. He had begun to meet a different kind of person in his professional life, people with university degrees from mainland universities, people with parents who owned property and talked about it as investment, people who held their forks a certain way and knew which bottle of wine to order without looking at the price. He was not a bad person for wanting those things. I want to be very clear about that. The wanting of a different life from the one you were born into is not a moral failing. It is, in many ways, a sign that a person is alive and paying attention and ambitious in the ways that ambition is supposed to work. I do not hold it against him that he wanted more than what he had grown up with. What I hold against him And even that phrase feels too harsh for what I actually feel, which is more like grief than anger, is the methodology. The particular way in which the wanting of something different led, by increments, to the erasure of what was real. In the months after Nora died, I helped Callum with 3 things that I have since thought about often. The first was his car. He had borrowed a significant amount of money to buy a vehicle that was outside his budget for the image it projected to clients, and the payments were creating real difficulty. I paid 3 months of payments without being asked, because he mentioned the difficulty in passing during a phone call, and I knew how to read between the lines of what he said and what he did not say. The second was a suit. He had a job interview with a larger firm that would represent a significant step forward. He had been invited to the preliminary interview with the suit he had, which was the suit he had bought for his honors presentation at university, bought then with money from his weekend job at a hardware warehouse, a suit that had served its purpose, but that he himself acknowledged did not quite fit anymore. I drove to a menswear shop on Collins Street in the city, and I bought him a suit that was better than anything I had ever owned for myself. I did not make a ceremony of it. I told him it was a practical investment. He wore it to the interview. He got the job. The third thing was 3 months of rent. He had moved to the better flat, and the better flat cost more than he had accounted for, and he was behind by 3 months, in a way that was causing him serious anxiety. He did not ask me directly. He said he was handling it. I said I knew he was handling it, and I transferred the money anyway, because I had it, and he needed it, and he was my son, and his mother would have wanted him to be able to sleep at night. I say these things not to present myself as a generous person. I say them because they are relevant to the story of how Callum and I understood each other during that period. He needed help, and I gave it without making him feel diminished by needing it, which is the only way to give help without it becoming a debt of shame. That was what I understood of fatherhood, that you fill the gaps without putting up a sign at the gap saying that you filled it. But what I did not understand, sitting in my chair in the quiet house after Nora died, was that Callum was building a version of himself that required the gaps to be invisible. Not just filled. Invisible. The financial difficulty, the wrong suit, the stretched budget, these were not simply problems he had solved. They were evidence of an origin he was beginning to want to conceal. And then he met Imogen. And Imogen came from a family where origins were everything, and the concealment, which had until then been a private project with no particular audience, suddenly had a very specific audience. And that audience had, in Graham Wallace, a man who assessed people the way you assess a building. Callum looked at what he had, and he looked at what Graham Wallace expected, and he began to fill the space between them with invention, a career in marine engineering consulting, connections to Sydney, a father who was reserved and preferred not to be in the public eye, a history that sounded, when told a certain way, like quiet respectability rather than honest labor. I was not supposed to notice any of this, and for a long time I mostly did not notice, or I noticed and told myself it was nothing, or I noticed and chose the word right when another word was available. But there are limits to the things a man can explain away. And on the 14th of July, sitting in a car on a side street in Hobart, those limits had been reached. What I did not know yet, sitting there in the cold with Eliza's photograph of me on her camera and the second video playing in my mind, was what Malcolm Reed was preparing to do. I did not know that he had spent the cocktail hour in increasing discomfort, that he had been given a name tag that said Leonard Ashford, father of the groom, and that wearing it had felt, he told me later, like wearing a costume made of someone else's skin, that he had twice declined to tell anecdotes about Callum's childhood to guests who asked, and each time Callum had smoothly redirected the conversation, and each time Malcolm had felt the particular helpless shame of a man who has agreed to something without fully understanding what it was. I did not know that Malcolm had spent the cocktail hour making a quiet decision, or that Eliza had spent it making a different one, or that Imogen, somewhere between her second glass of champagne and the beginning of the formal dinner, had looked at the wedding photograph display again, and then at Malcolm Reed, and felt, for the third time that afternoon, that something in the frame did not correspond to what she knew of her husband's story. The lie was already collapsing. I just did not know it yet. I was sitting in the cold car, watching the lit windows of the building, listening to the wind, turning the bruised carnation over in my hands, waiting for my son to come and get me. He did not come. The reception dinner was scheduled to begin at 6:30 in the evening. I know this because I had been given, 6 weeks earlier, a formal printed invitation to the wedding of Callum James Ashford and Imogen Frances Wallace, complete with the order of the day, in elegant gray type on cream cardstock. I had read it several times. I had put it on the kitchen table. I had eventually placed it on the shelf beside Nora's photograph, because it seemed like the kind of thing she would have wanted to see. The invitation had listed my name among the family members in attendance. It had not specified that my attendance would be conducted from within a parked vehicle. At 25 minutes past 6, I watched the last of the cocktail hour guests move from the outdoor terrace inside, following the current of warmth and light that the building offered against the July cold. The street became quiet again. The cobblestones were wet now from a brief rain that had passed through while I sat there, one of those Hobart squalls that arrives and departs without apologizing, leaving everything slightly darker and more defined. I had been in the car for just over 4 hours. I had drunk the coffee from the travel cup I had brought from home. I had eaten nothing. I had not turned on the radio. I had sat in the particular silence that belongs to a person who has made a decision not to act and is now living inside that decision with the full weight of its cost. Several times during those 4 hours, I had taken out my mobile phone and looked at it. Not because I expected a call. I had stopped expecting that somewhere around the second hour. I looked at it, the way you look at a door that you know is not going to open, but whose existence you keep wanting to confirm. There was one message from just after 3 in the afternoon. It was from Callum. It said, "Going well, won't be long now." I had read it 3 times. I had put the phone back on the passenger seat. Won't be long now. 4 words that described, with perfect compression, everything I needed to know about how my son had calculated this day. The 4 hours had been a calculation, an estimate. He had arranged a manageable inconvenience and assigned it a duration and expected it to resolve itself by the end of the cocktail hour so that the remainder of the evening could proceed with me reintegrated into the narrative in a secondary capacity, seated somewhere toward the back of the reception, introduced briefly to people who had spent the afternoon meeting Malcolm Reed, told that there had been some logistical issue with the photographs, given a glass of something and expected to absorb the day gracefully. I was not graceful about it, but I was quiet, which is not the same thing. When Eliza had gone back inside, promising to return if anything significant developed, I sat with the second video still running in my mind, the specific small movement of Imogen's head as she looked at the display photograph, the calculation in Callum's expression when he redirected her question, the particular slump in Malcolm Reed's posture when he declined the second request for a childhood anecdote, and the sentence, "Some people belong in memory, not in pictures." I'd been rolling that sentence over in my mind for 2 hours, and I kept finding new surfaces on it, new angles, new ways in which it was worse than the first way I had heard it. It was not simply an unkind sentence. It was a sentence that revealed an entire architecture of thinking. It revealed that Callum had at some point made a distinction between 2 categories of human being: the kind whose existence is documented and displayed and incorporated into the official record of a life, and the kind whose existence is acknowledged privately, but kept out of the frame. Memory versus pictures. The internal versus the external. The real story versus the presented one. And he had placed me, deliberately and with apparent peace, into the category of things that are kept out of the frame. I want to be accurate about what happened inside me during those 4 hours, because I think accuracy here matters more than drama, and because the inaccurate version of this story, the one where a wronged father sits in a car building toward righteous fury, is not the true one. The true one is less cinematic and more difficult. What happened inside me was not fury. It was something closer to a slow, geological event. The kind of thing that happens below the surface without visible movement, but that shifts the fundamental alignment of everything above. I was not becoming angrier. I was becoming, in some way I could not quite name, more still, more settled, not into acceptance, into something that felt, in its earliest form, like clarity. I thought about Nora. I thought about her in the specific way that I think about her when something is happening that she would have known how to handle better than I do. I thought about her voice, which was not a soft voice. Nora had opinions and expressed them without excessive ceremony, and I thought about what she would have said to Callum if she had been here to say it. I thought about the fact that she would not have said it gently, and I thought about the fact that she would not have been cruel either, because cruelty was never her register. She would have been direct. She would have said the true thing without performance. I had spent 3 years trying to learn how to be both of them at once. It was possible, I thought, sitting in the car, that I had been learning in the wrong direction. That absorbing difficulty quietly, which I had always understood as a form of strength, was in fact a form of permission. That every right I had said was a door I had left unlocked. That what I had called patience was sometimes, if I was honest with myself in the cold of a side street in July, a kind of fear dressed in quieter clothes. The fear of being the problem, the fear of making things worse, the fear of the particular loneliness that follows a confrontation with someone you love, when the confrontation does not go the way you needed it to, and you are left with both the original wound and the new one. I had been afraid of that loneliness. I had spent 3 years, since Nora died, being very careful not to do anything that might result in Callum pulling further away. And the terrible irony, sitting in the car on the 14th of July, was that all the care I had taken had resulted precisely in this. In being 30 meters from my son's wedding, with a bruised flower in my pocket and someone else's name on a chair inside. The fear had not protected me. It had simply made the thing that happened to me easier to arrange. I sat with that understanding for a while. I watched the lit windows of the building. I thought about Nora's roses along the back fence. Then Eliza came back. She knocked on the passenger window at 7:07. Her coat was pulled tight against the cold, and she had her camera bag over one shoulder. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been watching something develop inside a building and has come out to report because the person outside deserves to know. She said, "Malcolm is about to give a speech." I said, "The toast to the couple." She said, "Yes. Callum prepared something for him. Wrote it out on a card. Malcolm has the card." She paused. "He's been holding it for 20 minutes. He hasn't looked at it once." I understood what she was telling me. I said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "What are you going to do?" I looked at the building. I thought about the righteous version of this moment, the version that involves a man getting out of a car and walking through a door and claiming a seat and a microphone and saying everything that needs to be said. That version existed in my mind. It was not without its appeal. There is a part of every wronged person that wants, profoundly and urgently, to make the wrongness visible to the room. But I also knew, with the clarity that had been settling in me for 4 hours, that the version of justice that requires you to destroy your son's wedding is a version that leaves you with less than you started with. That walking through that door with the intention of making a scene was not protecting anything. It was only damaging things in a different direction. I said, "I'm going to stay here." She looked at me for a moment with the expression I was beginning to recognize as her way of processing respect. She said, "Okay. Then, there's something you should know. Imogen asked Callum about an hour ago why his father looked different from the photos. Callum told her Malcolm was a distant cousin who'd agreed to step in at the last minute because Leonard, which is you, wasn't feeling well and had to wait in the car. I said, he told her I was sick. She said, yes. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, what did she say? Eliza said, she said she hoped you felt better soon. She said she was looking forward to meeting you properly. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere inside the building, a burst of laughter rose and faded. I said, she doesn't know any of it. Eliza said, I don't think she does. I think she loves him, and she comes from a family where certain things are managed without discussion, and she has been told a version of this day that she has no particular reason to question. Yet, that last word sat in the air between us. I said, "Malcolm has the card?" She said, "He's been holding it for 20 minutes. I looked at the building again. Then I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. The hands of a man who had spent 31 years keeping complicated things running. The hands of a man who had bought his son a suit for a job interview and paid 3 months of someone else's rent, and stood in a florist on a cold morning and bought a white flower for a lapel because it was his son's wedding day. And that was what a man did. I said, "Go back inside." She said, "Are you sure?" I said. "Go back inside, Eliza. Whatever happens in there, make sure you're recording it." She nodded once. She went back to the building. I stayed in the car. I've since tried to reconstruct what happened inside the venue during the toasts, partly from what Eliza told me afterward, partly from what Malcolm Reed wrote to me in a letter he sent 3 weeks after the wedding, and partly from what Callum told me himself much later. On one of the evenings he came to sit in the kitchen at Napoleon Street without an agenda. The toasts had begun at 7:10. There had been one from the best man, a colleague of Callum's from the architecture firm, a competent and warmly received speech that covered the regulation territory of shared history and embarrassing anecdotes with sufficient skill. There had been one from Imogen's sister who was eloquent and moved people appropriately. There had been a brief response from Callum, who was, by all accounts, genuinely moving when he spoke about Imogen, the kind of genuine that cuts through prepared language and arrives unmediated. Then the microphone had been passed to Malcolm Reed. He had stood up. He had the card in his hand. He had looked at it for a moment. He had looked at the room, at the 80 people watching him with the particular warm expectancy of an audience that has already been moved several times and is ready to be moved again. He had looked at the card again. He had put it in his jacket pocket. He had said, "I've been asked to speak tonight as Leonard Ashford, father of the groom." A warm, attentive silence. He had said, "I've spent my career playing many roles. I've played heroes and villains. I've played kings and ordinary men. I've played fathers." He paused. "But tonight I was asked to play the only role that no actor should accept while the real man is available. The only role that isn't a performance. The only role that actually matters in a room like this." The silence had changed quality. The warmth was still there, but something else had entered it. Malcolm had said, "The real Leonard Ashford is outside. He's been outside for most of today. Not because he's unwell, not because of logistics, because his son made an arrangement that placed him there." Another pause. "I'm not going to tell you the reasons. That's a conversation for this family to have in private, and it isn't my conversation to give." He had looked at Callum then. Callum had been very still. Malcolm had said, "I'm going to say only this. I've been paid to play a lot of things. I've never felt less like myself than I have today. And I think Callum Ashford, who, I have no doubt, loves the woman he just married and wants to build something real with her, needs to understand that you cannot build something real on a foundation that requires another man to stand where you are not willing to let your father stand." He had put the microphone on the table. He had sat down. The room had been completely silent for what several witnesses described as a very long time. Imogen had looked at Callum. Not with fury, not with accusation, with the expression of someone who has just received a piece of information that is requiring rapid reorganization of a large amount of other information. The expression of a woman who is intelligent and has just been presented with evidence that a significant structural assumption was incorrect. Callum had not said anything. He had looked at the tablecloth. Graham Wallace had looked at Malcolm Reed with an expression that, if I am being honest, contained more confusion than anything else, which is perhaps the most accurate portrait of Graham Wallace that I can offer. He was a man who managed appearances and was encountering a situation that no amount of appearance management could immediately resolve. He had looked from Malcolm to Callum to Imogen to Malcolm again. His wife Margaret had put her hand on his arm in the way that wives put hands on arms when they are communicating, "Please do not make this worse," Nadine Bell, the wedding coordinator, had the expression of a professional who is watching a project go significantly off plan and is calculating damage in real time. She had been standing near the door to the kitchen. She had not moved. Eliza had been in the corner of the room near the display where the monitor used for the photo slideshow was connected. She had her camera bag open. She had been moving before Malcolm finished speaking. She had not played the full video. She did not need to. She connected the camera to the monitor and she let it run for 30 seconds. Just long enough, she told me later, for Callum's voice to be recognizable in the room. Just long enough for the phrase about the formal portraits and the instructions to Malcolm about posture and warmth. Just long enough for the room to hear, in Callum's own voice, the particular mathematics of what he had arranged. And then she stopped it. She told me later that she stopped it not because she wanted to protect Callum, but because she did not want to humiliate Imogen any further than the truth already had. Because what the truth already had done was enough. I was not in the room for any of this. I was on the footpath outside the venue, watching the light on the sandstone, having decided, for reasons that still feel right to me, that the exposure of the lie did not require my presence, that justice, in the form available to me on that day, was not a performance I needed to attend, that the truth had its own momentum, and my standing in the room would not have added to it. It would only have made it spectacle. I walked to the end of the street. I turned left toward the waterfront. I walked along the boardwalk past Salamanca Place with my hands in my pockets and the cold wind off the Derwent in my face, past the market stalls that were closed for the evening, past the boats along Constitution Dock that moved in the light swell with their particular patient creak. I walked past the places that Nora and I had walked on weekend mornings for 20 years, the places that still contained her in the way that places contain people who love them. I did not cry. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter than crying and deeper than it, which is the thing that people who have done a lot of grieving eventually understand about grief. It does not always come as a wave. Sometimes it comes as a tide, which is different. Waves arrive and break and recede. Tides change the level at which everything sits. I sat on a bench near the dock, and I looked at the water and I breathed the cold, clean air of a Hobart winter evening, and I thought about what it meant to love someone who had not been able to love you without conditions. Not that he did not love me. I do not believe that. I believe, and I continue to believe, that Callum loves me in the real and complicated way that children love parents they are also ashamed of, which is a very specific kind of love that contains genuine tenderness and genuine cruelty in the same space, and that the person experiencing it is often not fully aware of both being present. He was not a man who had sat down one day and decided to be cruel to his father. He was a man who had made a series of small decisions, each one individually defensible, that had accumulated into something he would now have to reckon with. I sat on the bench and I thought about whether I could survive the reckoning with him, whether there was a version of the relationship between us that could exist after today that was honest in a way the previous version had not been, whether honesty, even painful honesty, was a foundation rather than a demolition. I thought about Nora's roses. They had not been beautiful every season. There had been years they did poorly, years the aphids were bad, years the winter was too severe, and something needed cutting back hard in the spring. Nora had never given up on them. She had not been sentimental about the bad seasons. She had been practical. She had cut what needed cutting and fed what needed feeding and waited. I sat on the bench until the cold became something I needed to address rather than simply experience. Then I walked back to the car. I should tell you about Malcolm Reed's letter because it arrived 3 weeks after the wedding and changed something about how I understood the day. He wrote on plain white paper in careful longhand, the kind of handwriting that belongs to people who attended a certain kind of school or who take the act of writing seriously enough to have made it a practice. The letter was 3 pages long. I have read it many times. He introduced himself briefly, as if I might not remember, which seemed both unnecessary and considerate. He said he had thought a great deal about the wedding since it happened, and that he wanted to say several things that felt important. The first thing he said was that he had not understood, when he agreed to the engagement, that he was replacing a living present man. He had been approached by Nadine Bell's coordination company with a request for a family representative role for a formal event, the kind of work that occasionally comes to actors of a certain type and age. Memorial services where a family needs someone to give composure to a difficult moment. Anniversary celebrations where a distant figure needs representing. He had done this kind of work before and thought of it as a dignified service. He had not known, until he arrived at the venue on the 14th of July, that the man he was representing was sitting in a car 30 meters from the door. The second thing he said was about the moment he had asked Callum where the real father was. He described standing in the corridor feeling the particular disorientation of an actor who has been given a role and has just understood that the role is not what it was presented as. He said the feeling was not moral outrage, not at first. It was closer to vertigo, as if the floor of the thing he had agreed to had given way and revealed a much larger drop than he had anticipated. He said that when Callum answered that I was in the car, and that I knew, something settled in him that made the remaining hours very difficult. Not because Callum was unkind to him. Callum was professional and specific, and clearly under significant strain. But because wearing the name tag with my name on it while knowing I was 30 meters away had felt, with each passing hour, less like a professional engagement and more like a participation in something he did not recognize as himself. The third thing he wrote was about the toast. He said he had read the card 3 times in the 20 minutes before the microphone came to him. He said the card was good, as writing. Callum had written something that was warm and specific and would have sounded, to an audience that did not know the circumstances, like a father speaking from genuine love. He said reading it had made him feel, paradoxically, more certain that he could not deliver it, because the warmth in the words, which was real, which was clearly what Callum actually felt about his son in the deep sense beneath all the social engineering, the warmth in those words belonged to a man who was sitting in a car outside, and giving them a different body to live in would have been, in Malcolm's phrase, a kind of theft I hadn't been paid enough to commit. He said he put the card in his pocket and spoke as himself. He apologized for the disruption to the day. He said he did not know if it had helped me or harmed me or simply redirected a harm that would have happened regardless. He said he hoped that something good came from it eventually, the way difficult things sometimes do when they are handled with enough patience. He enclosed a check for the full amount of his fee. He said he could not keep it. I sat at the kitchen table and held the letter for a long time. Then I got up, and I went out to the garden, and I looked at Nora's roses in the cold, and I thought about a man I had never met before the 14th of July, who had stood up at a stranger's wedding and refused, at a real cost to himself, to make a lie more permanent. I thought about what it means when a stranger does the thing that the people who are supposed to love you did not do. I sent Malcolm Reed a letter in return. I thanked him. I told him about Nora briefly. I told him that I thought he had done the right thing, and that it was not his fault that he had been put in a position where doing the right thing was difficult. I told him to keep the check. He needed it. I did not. He wrote back. That correspondence continued for some months, and it became, unexpectedly, one of the things I look back on from that period with something uncomplicated. A man I met because my son hired him to pretend to be me became, through letters on plain paper, a person I trusted with my thinking. I do not know what to call that. I know that Nora would have found it both absurd and entirely fitting. Callum did not come to find me that night. I waited in the car until 9:30, which was 2 hours after I expected him, and then I started the engine and I drove home to Napoleon Street. The streets of Hobart at 9:30 on a winter Saturday are quiet, in the way that small cities are quiet when the weather has kept people inside, the kind of quiet that allows you to hear your own tires on the wet road and the sound of the heater and the sound of your own breathing. I parked on the hill outside the house. I sat in the car for a few minutes without getting out. The house looked small and solid and very much itself, the sandstone and the dark timber and the light I had left on in the front room. It looked, as it always looks, like a house that has survived a great many things by being too heavy to move. I went inside. I made tea. I sat in the chair. I looked at the photograph of Nora on the shelf. I said out loud to no one, "The ceremony was beautiful. Eliza confirmed it." Then I sat in the quiet for a long time, drinking my tea and listening to the house make its particular sounds in the wind off the river. And eventually I went to bed, which is what a person does at the end of a day, regardless of what the day has contained. I slept, which surprised me. In the morning I got up at 6, as I always do, and I made coffee, and I stood at the kitchen window, and I looked at the garden. The carnation was on the bench by the door where I had left it the night before. It was entirely bruised now. There was nothing white left in it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up and I put it in the compost bin in the back corner of the garden, near the roses, which seemed like the right place for a flower that had had a difficult day. Then I made breakfast and I sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper and I read it, which is what I do most mornings, and I was still reading it when my phone rang at 9:10. It was Callum. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." A pause. The particular pause of a person who has prepared something and is now uncertain whether the preparation was adequate. He said, "Are you home?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Can I come and see you?" I thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. Then I said, "Yes." He arrived 40 minutes later. He was still in the suit, which told me he had not been home yet, which told me something about the nature of the previous evening that I chose not to examine in detail. His hair was slightly less precise than it had been. His face had the particular hollowness of someone who has not slept and who has been doing significant internal work in the place of sleep. He sat down at the kitchen table. I made him tea. I sat across from him. He said, "I don't know where to start." I said, "Start with whatever feels most true." He looked at the table. He said, "I was ashamed of you, not of who you are, of how you would look, to them." He said them, the way people say words that have gotten too heavy. I thought if they could just see you in the right context, after they already knew me, after they already liked me, it would be fine. But in the photographs, in the official record of the day, I wanted everything to look a certain way. And I knew you wouldn't fit the version I'd been presenting. I said, "The version with the marine engineering and the Sydney connections." He looked up. His face did something complicated. He said, "You knew about that?" I said, "I knew." He said, "For how long?" I said, "Long enough." He put both hands flat on the table. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know how to say it in a way that matches what I did, because I don't think those words go that far. But I'm sorry." I looked at my son, 34 years old, still in his wedding suit, at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast for the 18 years he lived in this house. I looked at him and I thought about Nora, and about the roses, and about Malcolm Reed's letter, and about a white carnation put in a compost bin near a back fence. I said, "You asked another man to stand where I should have been standing." He said, "Yes." I said, "While I sat in the car." He said, "Yes." I said, "For 4 hours?" His jaw tightened. He said, "Yes." I let that sit in the room for a moment. Then I said, "I'm not going to shout at you. I'm not going to perform being your father now the way you wanted Malcolm to perform it. But I need you to hear me say the thing that is true, and I need you to actually hear it, not manage it." He said, "Okay." I said, "I have never been ashamed of what I am. I have never been ashamed of the port, or the work, or the hands, or the house, or your mother, or the way we lived. We lived honestly. We built something real. The things I helped you with, the suit, the rent, the car payments, I did those things not because I was trying to make you into something, but because I wanted you to have what you needed. And you took what I gave you, and you used it to build a story that didn't include me. And I need you to understand that that is not a small thing. That is not a logistical miscalculation. That is a choice about who deserves to exist in the official record of your life." Callum said nothing. But his eyes were doing something that I chose to read as hearing rather than managing. I said, "Some people belong in memory, not in pictures." He closed his eyes. I said, "I heard you say that. Eliza's camera was running." He said, "I know. She told me." I said, "Do you believe that?" A long pause. He said, "No. I believe I said it because I was frightened, and I was being practical, and I told myself it was temporary, and I know that is not an excuse." I said, "It is not." We sat in the kitchen for another hour and a half. We talked about Nora, which we had not done properly in 3 years. We talked about the phone call where he had told me about the marine engineering story, and I had said, "Right." We talked about the suit and the rent and what those things had meant to each of us. We talked about Graham Wallace and about the particular pressure of wanting to be accepted by a family that measures people carefully, and what that pressure does to a person who is already uncertain about whether their origins are something to be proud of or concealed. I told him that his origins were the best thing about him, even when he could not see it. He did not argue. He listened. At the end of the hour and a half, he said, "I need to tell Imogen everything." I said, "Yes, you do." He said, "She's going to be very angry." I said, "She's earned the right to be." He said, "What if she doesn't forgive me?" I said, "That is a risk that exists because you created it. And it is not a risk you can manage by managing the information. It is a risk you have to carry honestly, the way you carry things that are your own fault." He nodded. He stood up. He looked around the kitchen for a moment, at the shelf with Nora's photograph, at the window over the garden, at the table where we had just spent an hour and a half being more honest with each other than we had been in 3 years. He looked like a man who had just understood the specific weight of something he had been carrying without realizing how much of it was his. He said, "I'm going to go find her." I said, "Right." He looked at me. Something moved across his face. He said, "I'll come back, Dad." I said, "I know." He left. I sat at the table with my cold tea, and I listened to the front door close and his car start on the hill outside. Then I got up and I went into the garden and I stood near the roses for a while, just standing there in the cold morning air with my hands at my sides. They were doing all right, the roses. Not beautifully, but all right. There is a particular quality to the silence inside a house that has held a great deal of living. I noticed it again this morning, standing in the kitchen at Napoleon Street before the sun had fully cleared the hill to the east, waiting for the coffee to be ready and listening to the particular language the house speaks in the early hours. It is a language made of wood expanding in the cold and pipes adjusting to the demands of a morning, and the particular creak on the third stair from the top that has announced the presence of every person who has climbed those stairs in 22 years. Nora used to say that old houses accumulate the sounds of the people who lived in them, that if you listened carefully enough on a very quiet morning you could hear, underneath the ordinary sounds, the residue of every argument and every meal and every ordinary Tuesday that had ever happened inside the walls. I am not certain I believe that in any literal sense, but I understand what she meant. There is a difference between a house that has been inhabited for a long time by people who meant it and a house that has simply been occupied. You feel it when you walk in. You feel it in the quality of the silence. This morning the silence had the particular quality that it has now, in the spring of the year that follows the one I have been telling you about. A settled quality, not the settled quality of a place where nothing has happened. The settled quality of a place where things have happened and have been absorbed, and where the walls have made room for what has changed alongside what has remained. I poured the coffee. I stood at the window. The garden was visible in the early light, still slightly uncertain in the way that gardens are in September in Hobart, aware that spring has been declared but not entirely convinced that winter will not return for one final argument. The roses along the back fence were showing new growth, small and green and entirely committed to their own future in the way that growing things are committed, without consultation, without hesitation, simply because growing is what they do when the conditions allow. I thought about everything I have told you. I have been sitting with this story for a long time, not because I did not know how to tell it, but because I was not entirely certain, for many months, what the story was, not what happened. I knew what happened. I was there, but what it meant, what could be fairly said about it, what a person should take from it who was not Leonard Ashford, sitting in a blue Toyota Camry on a side street in Hobart on a cold July afternoon with a bruised carnation on his lap. I think I know now, or I know enough to say it out loud, which is not the same as knowing everything, but is perhaps the only honest starting point. The first thing I want to say is about shame, because shame is what drove the machinery of what happened on the 14th of July, and I think it is worth being precise about it. Callum was ashamed of me. Not of me as a person, not of the particular specific Leonard Ashford who made his lunches and fixed his bicycle and sat beside him in a hospital waiting room when he broke 2 ribs in a rugby match at 17 and told him bad jokes until the painkillers worked. He was ashamed of what I represented in a particular social context. The working hands, the port, the house on the hill in Battery Point that is small and genuine and not impressive in the way that certain other houses are impressive. The origin story that did not match the story he was trying to tell about himself to a specific audience. I have thought a great deal about shame in the months since the wedding, about what it is and where it comes from and what it does to a person who carries it. Shame is not the same as guilt. Guilt says, I have done something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Guilt is specific and can be addressed. Shame is architectural. It runs through the structure. It changes what a person believes they deserve and what they believe they are allowed to want and how they believe other people see them when they are not managing the presentation. Callum had developed, over the years that followed his move into the professional world he had worked hard to enter. A shame about his origins that he experienced, I think, as something close to survival. As if acknowledging where he came from would cost him something he could not afford to lose. As if the architecture of the life he was building required a different foundation than the one that actually existed. This is not an unusual thing. I want to say that clearly because one of the risks of telling a story like this is that the person whose behavior was wrong becomes a villain in a simple sense, and Callum was not a villain. He was a person who had developed, through a combination of personal ambition and social pressure, and a specific grief that he had not fully processed, a relationship with his own history that required him to manage it rather than inhabit it. That relationship had consequences. The consequences were serious. They were also the consequences of something that is recognizably, uncomfortably human. The people who arranged things to look a certain way at the expense of something true are not monsters. They are people who have decided at some point and for reasons that made sense to them at the time that appearance is more protective than honesty, that the version of events that can be controlled is safer than the version that cannot, that certain people, certain origins, certain stories belong in memory rather than in pictures. The cost of that decision is the thing that the story of the 14th of July is about. The cost is not simply to the person who is kept out of the frame. The cost is to the person who arranged the keeping. Because you cannot build a life honestly on a foundation that requires another man to stand where you are not willing to let your father stand. You cannot be fully present in a marriage whose first official day required a performance by a stranger. You cannot know yourself clearly when the story you tell about yourself requires continuous management and the occasional erasure of witnesses. Callum is learning this. He is learning it the way most people learn the most important things, slowly, uncomfortably, through the specific friction of being honest when dishonesty has been the easier habit. He is learning it with Imogen beside him, which is a form of luck he did not entirely earn, and which I hope he understands as the gift it is. The second thing I want to say is about fathers. I am aware that the story I have told you is, in its surface form, a story about a specific event on a specific day involving specific people in a specific city. But underneath the specific event, there is something more general that I think is worth naming. There is a particular kind of invisibility that happens to men of a certain age and a certain background in the context of a world that measures people by different metrics than the ones they were built by. The mechanic's hands are not the architect's hands. The small house is not the large house. The decades of maintenance work, of keeping complicated things running, of understanding through direct contact with the world what holds and what fails, this knowledge does not present itself well in the contexts where other kinds of knowledge are the currency. And there are people in your life, sometimes the people you love most, who learn to read the currency of those contexts and who look at what you are and calculate, quietly and not always consciously, the gap between what you are and what those contexts require, and who make decisions in that gap that they believe are practical and that you experience as the removal of your right to exist in certain rooms. I sat in the car for 4 hours not because I was too weak to walk through the door. I sat in the car because I had spent 3 years learning, in small increments, that walking through the door was not something I was supposed to do, that my presence was a problem to be managed, that the version of me that could be tolerated was a reduced version, a version kept in the car, brought out selectively, presented in contexts where the damage could be controlled. I let this happen. I need to say that clearly, and without excessive self-criticism, but clearly. I let it happen because I was afraid of the specific loneliness that follows confronting someone you love with the truth of what they are doing to you. I let it happen because I had conflated patience with passivity. I let it happen because I had been raised to absorb difficulty without making it someone else's problem, which is a virtue in certain circumstances and a liability in others, and I had not been sufficiently precise about which circumstance I was in. The thing I learned, in the car and in the conversations that followed, is that staying silent in the face of your own erasure is not protection. It is not kindness. It is not the behavior of a man who is making things easier for the people he loves. It is the behavior of a man who is cooperating with his own disappearance, and the cooperation makes the disappearance more complete, not less. The first honest thing I did in 3 years was ask Eliza Hart to take my photograph. Not to publish it, not to use it against anyone, simply to create a record that I had been present, that I had existed in that space on that day, that the frame that was officially being constructed did not contain the only truth available. That small act, requesting the existence of one true image, was the beginning of refusing to cooperate with the disappearance. If you are a father reading this, or a grandfather, or a man who has found himself in circumstances where the people who are supposed to love you have made you into a logistical inconvenience, I want to say this to you as clearly as I know how. Your presence is not a problem to be managed. Your origin is not something that needs to be concealed. Your hands and your history and the specific honest way in which you built your life and raised your children and buried your losses and kept going are not liabilities in the context that matters. They are the context that matters. They are the only context in which a real life can be constructed and lived. The frame that excludes you is the smaller frame. The picture that does not contain you is the poorer picture. And the person who arranged the exclusion is not protecting themselves. They are diminishing themselves in ways that will take them much longer to understand than it took them to arrange. The third thing I want to say is about Malcolm Reed. I think about him often, not obsessively, not in the way that you think about someone who has harmed you, in the way that you think about someone who surprised you with their character in a moment when character was not guaranteed. I have been trying to do what she would have done. It is slower and harder without her, but it is the only work that matters. The work of being honest with the people you love, at the cost that honesty sometimes requires. She taught me that, not through instruction, through example, through 31 years of mornings in the kitchen and evenings in the garden and a folder of pruning notes with her handwriting in the margins. I keep the folder on the shelf now, between the photograph of her and the photograph of me. It is September now, the morning I began this story. In an hour, Callum is coming. He called last week to ask if he could spend the day, just the two of us, no agenda. He said Imogen was visiting her sister in Launceston, and he had been thinking about spending a day the way they used to spend Saturdays, meaning the way they spent Saturdays when he was still living at home, which involved coffee and the newspaper and the garden, and occasionally a drive out along the river road if the weather was good enough. I said yes. I said come at 9. It is 8:45. I have been standing at the kitchen window with my coffee for 20 minutes, looking at the garden in the spring light. The roses are doing what they do in September, which is to put out growth with the particular confidence of something that has survived a difficult winter and is not interested in being cautious about spring. They are not yet flowering. They are still in the architectural phase, the phase of stem and leaf and structure, the phase that is less immediately beautiful than the flowering, but that contains, if you look at it the right way, everything that the flowering will eventually be. I think a great deal about structure lately, about what holds, about the difference between the things that look impressive and the things that actually bear weight, about foundations. I built my life on a particular foundation. Honest work, a marriage that told the truth, a house on a hill in Battery Point that is small and solid and entirely itself, children raised with whatever love and attention I was capable of bringing in the seasons when I had it to give. That foundation is not elegant. It does not present well at certain kinds of dinners. It does not sound impressive when described to people who use impressiveness as their primary metric. But it held. Through Nora's death and 3 years of grief and a wedding day spent in a parked car and a photograph taken on a footpath and a conversation at a kitchen table and 6 months of difficult incremental honesty, it held. Not because it was perfect, because it was real, because the things built on honest foundations do not require continuous maintenance of the story. They simply stand in the way that things stand when they were built correctly. The car outside makes the particular sound of a door being closed quietly, the way Callum always closes doors, carefully, having been raised in a house where the walls were thin and the neighbors close. His footsteps on the stone path, a knock at the door. I put down my coffee cup. I straighten my collar, which is a habit I have and which serves no practical purpose. I walk to the door and I open it. My son is standing on the step with 2 coffees from the waterfront cafe and a slightly uncertain expression that is becoming, with each visit, slightly less uncertain. He is 34 years old and he is learning, at 34, some of the things he should have been learning over the previous decade, which is not ideal but which is also entirely consistent with how most important learning happens, in the specific conditions that make it unavoidable. He says, "Morning, Dad." I say, "Morning." He holds up the coffees. I step back to let him in. The door closes behind him and the house makes its particular sound of accommodation, the sound it makes when someone who belongs in it has come home, and we walk together through the kitchen to the garden door and out into the September morning where the roses are deciding, in their unhurried way, to become something remarkable again. We sit in the garden chairs. We drink the coffees. A bell from a boat somewhere on the river. Wind in the trees on the hill above the house. The sounds of a small city that has been going about its business for a long time and will continue to do so without requiring anyone's permission. He looks at the roses for a while. Then he says, "They're doing well." I say, "They are." He says, "Mom would be pleased." I say, "Yes, she would." We sit with that for a moment. The particular silence of 2 people who are both thinking about the same person and do not need to explain it to each other. The silence that belongs to shared history, the kind that cannot be constructed or hired or performed, that exists only between people who actually share the thing it is made of. The morning light comes over the hill to the east and arrives in the garden the way it does in spring in Hobart, sideways and clean and honest, showing you exactly what is there. I hold my coffee cup in my hands, the hands of a man who worked 31 years in maintenance and knows the difference between something fixed and something merely repaired, and I feel the warmth of the cup through my palms, and I breathe the cold garden air, and I sit with my son in the spring morning. This is what was worth staying for, not the confrontation, not the revelation, not Malcolm Reed standing up with the card in his pocket, or Eliza connecting the camera to the monitor, or Graham Wallace sitting at this kitchen table with his tea recalibrating his assessments. Those things mattered, They were necessary. They were the specific friction required to move something that had been stuck for too long in the wrong position. But this is what the friction was for. This Saturday morning, these coffees, this garden, this son sitting 3 feet from me in the chair that was his mother's, talking about roses in the careful way that people talk about things they are only beginning to know how to talk about. My son hired a man to stand where I should have been standing. A camera left running showed the room the truth. And I stayed. I stayed in the car and on the footpath and in the kitchen and in the garden, and through the months of difficult incremental honesty, and through the visits that were stiff and the visits that were less stiff, and through the morning of the 14th of September when my son knocked on the door with 2 coffees and a slightly uncertain expression. I stayed because that is what a father does who means it. Not because he is owed a particular result. Not because staying guarantees that things will go the way he needs them to go, but because the alternative, leaving, giving up, deciding that the cost of continued presence was too high, would have been the one form of erasure he could have chosen for himself. I chose not to erase myself. I chose to exist in the frame, in the photograph on the footpath, in the kitchen conversation, in the garden on a spring morning with cold coffee and growing roses, and a son who is learning, slowly and honestly, and at some real cost to his comfort, how to sit beside his father without improving the image of him first. That is the whole of it. That is what I needed to say. My name is Leonard Ashford. I am 58 years old. I live in a small house on Napoleon Street in Battery Point, Hobart, Tasmania. I worked 31 years in maintenance at the port. I have hands that show it. I was married to Nora for 26 years, and I loved her in the specific, complete way that only becomes fully visible in the years after it is no longer possible. I have one son, and on a Saturday morning in September, he is sitting in the chair beside me in the garden his mother planted, drinking coffee from a cup he brought me, looking at roses that are deciding to become something remarkable, and he is here, and so am I. That is enough. That has always been enough. That is the only thing that was ever required.